Thank you, everyone, for being at today's work session on Affordable Housing 101. We have Erica Brandt and Larry Jarvis from Housing and Neighborhoods here with us today.
So good afternoon, Mayor Baldwin, members of council. We're glad to be here. It is a beautiful afternoon, and we have pulled together, I think, some very good information to share with you this afternoon to help explain some of the issues and questions that particularly the new council members have been asking about. So hopefully this will be informative this afternoon. So we do have a presentation for you that Erica Brandt is going to give for you. Ask you to feel free to pause and ask questions during the presentation. And then Erica and I will be here for questions both during the presentation and for any follow-up questions that you might have. And of course, if there are questions that you have that we're not able to address this afternoon, we will make note of those and report back to you through whatever the best mechanism might be. So with that, I'm going to ask Erica Brandt to come up and begin the presentation. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you, Larry. Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. Erica Brandt with Housing and Neighborhoods. So as Larry said, we're going to do kind of a 101 today that highlights some of the most pressing issues in affordable housing facing Raleigh and some of the questions that council members have brought up. Here's our agenda for the day. We'll start with an overview of the affordable housing landscape, the different programs and players that make up that landscape. Then we'll do a deeper dive into housing choice rental vouchers and the Raleigh Housing Authority programs. We'll talk more about affordable rental or low-income housing tax credit 101. And then we'll finish out with a discussion of the regulatory environment that impacts affordable housing and housing affordability in general. So to start, we'll talk about the landscape. So this graphic illustrates the primary types of housing and housing programs that make up the affordable housing landscape. I hope you all can see it. I know it's there's a lot going on in here, and we'll kind of walk through it a little bit step by step. So the x-axis across the bottom, that arrow, represents income levels, with the lowest incomes on the left and the higher incomes on the right. So at the highest end of the income spectrum, we've got market rate housing, which includes rental and for sale housing. The kind of next area there in the middle between the 60 to 100% of area median income is naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH, which is naturally occurring by virtue of being older, as I think you all know, being kind of less well-maintained or maybe in less desirable or less expensive areas. Also around this income level, we've got down payment assistance, which is the little band in gray. And these programs are for income-eligible first-time home buyers, usually targeting the 60 to 80% AMI range, and typically provided by public entities like local governments or nonprofits. And then we'll get to the low-income housing tax credit program, which is that long yellow band, kind of the third down. The LIHTC program, as it's abbreviated, on average, the income targeted there is 60% of the area median income, although many units included in the properties will target lower income levels down to 30%. And due to the new income averaging guidelines allowed in the program, they can include units up to 80% AMI as long as the overall average income of the property is 60%. And then we'll get to the lower end of the income spectrum here. And at this lowest end of the spectrum are the most intensive programs and the most intensive services. These require the most subsidy and typically do involve services as well. And the reason for that is that people with disabilities are disproportionately represented among 30% AMI households, and many people at this income level rely on fixed incomes like disability payments, like supplemental security income, which is administered through Social Security. And to give an example of what that payment looks like or what that income looks like, the current annual SSI payment for one individual is about $11,000 a year, which is 15% of the area median income. So as you can imagine, folks in the 30% AMI and below kind of range may actually be earning well below 30% of the AMI. And because of this, you'll see that supportive housing, which is subsidized housing that's paired with supportive services for people with disabilities, is one of the primary housing types that targets the lowest end of the income spectrum. And that's the green band there, kind of third down. So supportive housing includes transitional housing, which are time-limited housing programs, typically no more than 2 years. An example of this would be a residential substance use recovery program, and also permanent supportive housing, which, as the name suggests, are permanent. Single-room occupancies are the other example up here. This is a type of permanent housing, and these are residential properties with multiple single-room units that are intended for occupancy by one individual, and they tend to have shared facilities like bathrooms or kitchen facilities. Typically, SRO housing is some of the lowest cost housing to rent, but in our market, it's not a big player. The city zoning doesn't really easily allow for construction of new SRO units or conversions of existing units into the SRO model. So it's not a big part of the picture locally. And then finally, the other major housing providers in this kind of bottom end of the income spectrum are the public housing authorities. And housing authorities have two main programs, the kind of bricks and mortar public housing, and then vouchers. And we'll talk about these in more depth next. So again, PHAs are the primary provider serving the 30% AMI household income band. 85% of voucher holders are earning 30% of the area median income or below, and 75% of public housing occupants are 30% AMI. And both of these programs have very high demand and very high utilization. There are more than 9,000 households that are on the voucher wait list and more than 6,000 households on the public housing wait list. And the wait time for both of these is at least 2 years, and in some cases upwards of 7 years. And voucher utilization is very high. It's 91% currently. And what the utilization rate means is that 91% of folks who have been issued a voucher are using that voucher. They've got a unit, they're renting it with the voucher. The other 9% are folks who usually have a voucher in hand and are looking for a unit. And only about 300 vouchers turn over annually and become available to people on those wait lists, which is why that wait time is so long. So part of the challenge that families face in trying to use their vouchers is that they can only be used to rent units that are at or below fair market rent, which is set by HUD and updated each year. And I've put the current fair market rent on this slide. As you can see, the HUD determined fair market rent is pretty well below what most of us would consider the market rent for this area. You're looking at, $1,200 for a 2-bedroom unit, and typically in our market, you'll see closer to $2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom unit. And in addition to that, the FMR level includes tenant-paid utilities, so the actual rent paid toward the unit is typically has to be $50 to $150 lower than that FMR limit to account for that utility allowance. So because of this constraint, about 72% of voucher holders actually are renting units in subsidized housing, primarily in LIHTC units. So LIHTC units are really the only new rental units that are being built that are accessible to voucher holders. Beyond building more LIHTC units, the main way to create units that are accessible for voucher holders is to recruit landlords of NOAA units to participate in the program. And Wake County has recently launched a program that tries to do just this. It's trying to recruit private market landlords to rent to voucher holders and other people with housing barriers who are exiting homelessness or have other referrals from agencies by offering financial incentives to landlords. It's called the Lease to Home program, and some of those incentives include up to $1,000 to cover damages above security deposits and standard turnover costs, up to 2 months of rental payments if a unit is vacant, if it's vacated before the lease or for more than 30 days. And then they'll also assist with placing a new tenant through a referral program. $500 for every lease signed, and $750 if the landlord will accept a voucher. And then $1,000 for lease renewals. So trying to keep landlords not just to sign up for this program and participate, but to continue and renew leases and stay involved. So we'll move now to talk about the low-income housing tax credit program and do kind of a 101 on rental development, both affordable and market rate. So first, I'll start with this timeline overview of the real estate development process. And I hope y'all can read the gray. It's probably a little bit hard to read up there, but I'll talk us through it. So this is just the basic process that applies for really any real estate project, be it market rate or affordable. And as you can see, the typical timeline for even the most straightforward projects is a multi-year process. Just the project conception stage, which is coming up with the idea, analyzing the site, doing a feasibility analysis and some due diligence, some market analysis, and then the pre-development phase of trying to get together your financing, going through the entitlement process and getting your permits. All of that can take up to 2 years, and that's pretty typical. The construction phase typically lasts another 12 to 18 months. And then the completion, where you're getting certificates of occupancy and leasing up all the units, can take up to 6 months. So it is a pretty long process in the best of scenarios. So the way that rental development works, both market rate and affordable, is that the cost of rental development has to be covered by financing, typically debt and equity. The repayment of that financing, namely the debt or debt service, and then payment of the expenses that are required to operate the property, make up the ongoing operating costs. So that's what's shown in that kind of middle stack in this graphic here. You can see the operating expenses are kind of the top component of that tower, and then the debt service to pay back on the financing is the bottom section. So the cost to develop and operate a project really is what determines the rent that is required. The rent has to be sufficient to make those debt service payments and to cover the operating expenses. And I'll note here that both market rate and affordable projects tend to be 100% leveraged, which means that they're really maxing out the amount of bank debt that they can get, because it does tend to be harder to find equity investors. So maxing out that bank debt means that the debt service is higher, and that is kind of what drives the rents. So the LIHTC program, is still a real estate development, still has the same basic model required for market rate. But the way that it's able to be affordable is that the tax credit program incentivizes equity from investors. And then there also tends to be a good bit of soft debt, such as the city's gap financing. And these both factor in to reduce the hard debt service that is owed each month by the project. So having a lower debt service each month means that the monthly rents charged can be lower. And that's really how the program creates affordability for tenants. So this graphic kind of compares a market rate to a tax credit capital stack. On the left, you'll see the market rate example. You've got the hard debt is kind of taking up 2/3 or more of that capital stack. There's a little bit of equity on the top. And then in the tax credit program, you've got more equity. You've got soft debt as well, which typically has kind of no repayment or very low repayment or variable repayment based on cash flow, and then a smaller amount of hard debt. And the rents are different as a result. So the low-income housing tax credit program is very tightly regulated. There's regulated both federally and then by the State Housing Finance Agency, which is the state agency that runs the program, that awards the tax credits to projects and sets a lot of the rules. There are specific reserve amounts that are required to pay for, replacements or operating expenses that run over the expected or budgeted amounts. There's limits on contractor and developer profit. There's a legally binding 30-year affordability period. A debt coverage ratio of 1.15 is required, so there has to be more than enough cash flow to pay back that debt service. An independent cost certification is required on completion of the project to ensure that all the costs being reported are, in fact, what the project did cost. And then the rents need to be approved each year by the Housing Finance Agency, or NCHFA. So the average total subsidy that's required to create one low-income housing tax credit unit is $159,000. And the total subsidy here includes the equity from the tax credit program and also the soft debt or the gap financing from the city or from another entity. And the city's contribution of that on average is about $37,000 per unit. By design, the LIHTC projects have low cash flow. They're not throwing off a lot of cash. The really only profit that developers are getting is through the developer fee, which is different than market rate development. So in market rate development, the developers are really profiting when the project is built and sold. And these projects are typically bought by investors that are seeking long-term stable cash flow. And as I said, in the LIHTC program, those developers are just profiting from the developer fee, which is set and capped by the Housing Finance Agency. I think right now, under the current plan and rules from the agency, the fee is capped at $20,000 a unit for new construction LIHTC projects. So to create affordable units in a market rate project outside of the tax credit model, as many communities are trying to look into and are interested in, that $159,000 per unit subsidy needs to come from somewhere because the developer still needs to get financing for the project. Their lenders typically want to see some kind of minimum yield on cost to feel comfortable lending on the project, and investors, of course, want to get some kind of return on their investment. So one way that creating affordable units is incentivized in market rate developments is through land subsidy. And this kind of illustrates why that alone is not enough to make up that $159,000 per unit subsidy needed. So if you look on the left here, we've got, let's assume, a 4-acre plot that costs $6 million. And under its current zoning and entitlement, 200 units are allowed, which means that there's $30,000 of land cost going into it per unit. And if you put on a zoning incentive or a density bonus to that plot of land and allow the project to double its entitlement to 400 units, you are reducing that cost per unit to $15,000 a unit and providing a $15,000 a unit subsidy. But the remaining gap is still $144,000 a unit. So it's helpful, but it's not really enough. So this will kind of lead us into a discussion about the affordable housing regulatory environment. Cities are trying to incentivize more affordable housing production outside of the LIHTC model, and what the overall impact is of the regulatory environment on housing affordability. So one of those major strategies to incentivize affordability in market rate development or outside of the existing programs is policy incentives like inclusionary zoning. And although these policies are certainly well-intended, there is some evidence out there that they can have unintended consequences. Some research has found that there is an adverse impact on overall affordability because the inherent required subsidy to create those affordable units comes by raising the cost of the market rate units. So some research has shown that inclusionary zoning can increase market rate housing prices in markets where inclusionary zoning policies are active. And then projects can also run into some financing and property management issues. Typically, the folks that are financing, both on the lending and the investing side, on LIHTC projects are different and have different expectations, different comfort zones than people who are doing the same for market rate. And a market rate lender or investor is typically not going to be super comfortable with having affordable units in that project and vice versa. And property management is similar. The folks who are managing market rate properties have a certain set of expectations and processes that they follow and may not be accustomed to things like rent certifications, making sure that the rents every year are at a certain level, doing tenant recertifications every time a new tenant moves in, and doing an annual recertification for every tenant who's already living there. So there can be some issues with just trying to keep the compliance pieces straight. So this snapshot image here on the right is from a Furman Center brief that was published back in 2008. And the takeaway of that brief was really that in trying to examine the impacts of inclusionary zoning programs, there's really a lack of much evidence. It's something that not many people have looked into, and even those who have looked into the programs are unable to really pull a lot of solid conclusions about best practices and impacts. And as we know, it's not really the real measure of policy success isn't just the adoption of a policy or having a policy, but it's what are the outcomes of the policy? What is the impact on affordability? So what we do know, what the research does show, is that nationwide, about a third of inclusionary zoning programs have actually not created any affordable units yet since adoption. And voluntary programs are especially difficult because, they're voluntary. Developers don't need to participate. So most voluntary inclusionary zonings have not produced any affordable units. There's a study done last year looking at what the elements of more successful inclusionary zoning policies are, and I've listed some of those up here. They include older policies that have been around longer, policies that have more flexibility in terms of the income levels that are allowed to be targeted and the compliance options for meeting the requirements of the policy, policies that have lower minimum set-asides and more incentives for the developers, and then policies that focus on serving moderate income versus very, very low income households. I will say that one caveat of this study is that it's kind of a big picture, right? They looked at a bunch of different policies and pulled out these pieces and themes, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the local context. So it's not as if you designed a policy that had all of these things, you would necessarily be guaranteed a successful outcome. But these are kind of the things that emerged as more associated with more successful policies. So locally, we do have one longer running example of an inclusionary zoning program, which is in Chapel Hill. So it's only been around since 2015, but since its inception 8 years ago, the program has actually resulted in only about 25 affordable units, although almost 200 units have been approved and committed. Almost $1 million has been paid in lieu instead of physical units, which have gone to the town's affordable housing fund. And that amount equates to about $5,000 paid per market rate unit constructed in those projects that did pay in lieu. And so based on that average subsidy of $159,000, that would create about a little over six affordable units. So the takeaway here, I think, is that inclusionary zoning and other zoning-based strategies are a tool in the toolkit. They may help create affordable units, but it may also have a negative or unintended impact on the overall affordability of the local housing market. So although housing costs are certainly rising a lot in Raleigh, the city has managed to largely stay more affordable than its peers because the regulatory environment here does allow by right development in many situations. And adding hoops to the development process may overall harm affordability and housing supply. There's a 2021 study that examined the impacts of entitlement processes in California, which, as we know, is one of the places with the most severe housing crisis, and also a place that is really turning to zoning-based incentives to try to address the crisis. And that study looked at the impacts of entitlement processes on housing affordability and equity in the placement of housing, and found that zoning and the development review process that hinder more dense and efficient development are really the main regulatory mechanisms that are contributing to the housing crisis. So we've discussed a range of tools here for creating housing affordability, including the primary programs that are really responsible for creation of most affordable housing and provision of most affordable housing, the low-income housing tax credit, and then the programs that are managed by housing authorities, public housing, and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And we've also discussed some of the zoning-based regulatory incentives and impacts, and some of the consequences that may be unintended in some of those, and some of the things we just don't really know about the impacts there yet. So I'm happy to answer any questions and open it up for discussion.
Thank you for that presentation. Lots of information there. Do we have questions? Councilmember Melton?
Told myself I would wait, but I didn't see any other hands. Can't help myself. I have two questions. You mentioned in the slide towards the lower AMI spectrum that one of the opportunities or tools are SROs, so single room occupancy, and it's challenging because they're not really allowed in Raleigh. And I know that we had asked for a text change or for planning to look at ways we may be able to legalize them. Do we know or have an update on where we're at in that process?
We'll find out.
Okay.
I don't know, but
that may be.
Well, Tansy was just coming up to
Sorry, Tansy. Go ahead.
respond.
I'm TNC Hayward, Deputy City Manager. Ken Bowers is here and may be able to add more. That was there haven't been a bunch of these since the new members have been seated. There is a process for individuals in the community to request a text change. So this text change was actually initiated by a private individual that asked for a text change that would allow right now, we've got some things that are called like rooming houses and other kinds of things that would allow a similar construct under a text change. I believe that that is in final drafting. I think it was listed as one of those text changes that's in drafting in a prior presentation to the council. So I don't believe that it is in a final form or has been shared any of our public comment procedures at this time. We can certainly get a more detailed update. Right now, you can produce that outcome, but most of those require a special permit that would go through a public review process.
Okay. Well, sort of tied to that we heard during this presentation that the reason why, in part, Raleigh has been able to stay relatively affordable with regard to our peer cities is because, I guess, our regulatory environment is not quite as burdensome. And so the other question I had was, for the LIHTC projects, you mentioned the pre-development phase can take up to 2 years, which includes a lot of the permitting and all of those other things. Is there anything that we could do that we're not doing to speed that up?
So the city did create this expedited review process, I think a year or two ago, which is still kind of, we're still working out the kinks. I think that's going to help a lot. I think it has helped a lot. And I think continuing to streamline that program will help a lot. And it's actually something that other, peer cities around here, including Chapel Hill, are trying to do something similar to cut down the length of entitlement process.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Harrison?
Thanks, Erica and Larry, for the presentation. Just a couple questions. I'm just curious, from your perspectives, what is the best way that we can scale up, the city subsidy available? So I think you had mentioned it was like $37K out of the total 159 for a 60% AMI. And so, it's my understanding, we've had, affordable housing bonds, we have a property tax. We could perhaps have more funds from the general fund for housing in neighborhoods. I'm just curious, from your all's perspective, how do we scale, our own contributions up, sustainably?
Well, I think we are going to see the need to do that because, again, the number that Erica was citing was kind of a historical average. But as we look at trying to bring sites online that are in proximity to transit, we know that per unit subsidy is going to be substantially greater. And recently you've seen and approved our acquiring sites and then leasing them back to the developer, again, for projects near transit. So I think as some of these sites we put into play, like Duplex Village that we acquired several years ago, we anticipate putting that out for an RFP probably within the next few months after the zoning is in place. I think that's going to tell us, what that additional subsidy would need to be. And I think there has been discussion about ultimately is it 2 cents on the tax rate that you would want to do so that you're sustainable, so that you're not limited to voters having to approve a bond issue with some regularity. That was kind of the analysis that we went through several years ago when we wound up on that initial 1 cent on the tax rate, is that this is something that was predictable, we could plan around that, and it was not subject to, periodic approval by the voters. So definitely the simplest thing would be, again, the 2 cents as opposed to the 1 cent. But I'm looking at the city manager, she's looking away from me. But that would be, something that could be considered down the road.
Isn't that what Durham has 2 cents? Is that correct?
Yeah, I was there when they got the 1 cent.
Yeah,
And then
and
they
now they're
added
at
the
2.
2 cents, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Wasn't looking away, Larry. I was looking at the chart, actually.
Okay,
So,
all right.
I'm there with you. I get
Okay,
you.
all right.
Thank you. And I guess another question perhaps for you, Larry or Erica. the data studies that were mentioned about inclusionary zoning and impacts were interesting to me, and I noted that there were a couple factors in ones that showed the policies to perhaps be more successful. So I think there was a mention of older policies being more successful, and then also policies that are focused on moderate income households. I don't know if you can talk more to that piece.
Well, I'll let Erica add too, but some of the older inclusionary zoning programs, and inclusionary zoning was born, being an old planner, I can tell you, it was born in Montgomery County, Maryland. So where they were successful really were in having some homeownership units that were for that, median to moderate income buyer, as opposed to the more deeply affordable rental units. So Erica, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think the reason that it works better when you're doing moderate income units is just because that inherent subsidy is less. So it's just slightly more feasible.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and I think it is a debate, I hear a lot about, whether that's an effective policy. And I think at this point in Raleigh, the affordability, unfortunately, has gone down for a lot of, middle-class households, folks who are, even at that 100% AMI. We can see most for sale housing is at 120% or greater, or much greater. And so, I think that is a policy we should be, thinking about. I know that in the NCGA, there is a Senate bill that would look at prohibiting, kind of right now there's a prohibition on rent control. And so if this bill were to pass, it may not, it would actually allow municipalities to have authority to look at rent control programs. And so I'm just curious, is that kind of going along with how you were defining inclusionary zoning here, or would that be just something totally different?
I guess that wasn't really part of what we looked into. I think it would be a little different, but a rent-controlled unit would be subject to legally binding affordability requirements, and so in some ways it could be similar. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to learn more about those programs. And I realize it's not something that's in our authority right now, but just the effectiveness and perhaps in future, I guess a manager's note or something like that, just to better understand the effectiveness of rent control. Thanks.
Yeah, we can look into that.
There's lots of examples from New York City that could be really interesting. Mm-hmm. I think it was Mayor Pro Tem and then Councilor Patton.
So I had the pleasure of speaking to some realtors today, and they mentioned a collective that's happening in Philly area, as well as I think in Atlanta, as far as working with small business and housing. Can we look into that and see how we can, because one of the major pillars of our LIHTC program is in the scoring is how close it is to maybe a grocery store and things of that nature. But maybe if we start looking at purpose-built communities where we can kind of work there, but also it gave the community, I think it's about giving the community also a sense of ownership. Mm-hmm. And a way to build wealth as well, to empower themselves. So I just wanted to pass that information along. And also one thing I noticed too is, and maybe I'm wrong, or Larry, maybe I'm just getting old too, but it seems like to build these projects is taking longer than it used to. Would I be accurate?
It is getting longer than it used to, and one of the factors there is that all the good sites have already been taken. So a lot of the sites that are in play right now for development of the tax credit program are problematic sites. That's only going to get worse because, in the city of Raleigh, as you well know, so many of the sites that have come before you have been in Southeast Raleigh, and that's simply because that's where the available sites are. And going forward, so many of our opportunities are going to be redevelopment opportunities where it's going to involve, tearing down whatever there might be there right now. Duplex Village being a classic example where, we acquired a very low density existing development to redevelop that. But going forward, most of what we're going to be looking at are not going to be greenfield sites. They're going to be redevelopment, which are going to be much more complicated, take much longer, and cost us a lot more.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Pat.
Yeah, I have a couple. Thanks for the presentation. Appreciate it. One question I had was around the voucher program and the voucher usage. And I see that, as you mentioned, the fair market rent is lower than what we actually see in our market. And I was curious if you've ever seen any models where the city provides like additional gap financing to kind of bridge that gap.
I am not a public housing expert, but I'm going to hazard a guess that it would be complicated to layer on top of an existing like federal voucher program. I know plenty of localities have local voucher programs, including Wake County has a local voucher program. And I know just a little bit enough about this to be dangerous, but certainly not very much. But I remember years ago, I don't know where it's at now, but there was a pilot looking at small area fair market rents. So rather than looking at an entire metro area, trying to break it down in cases like where in Raleigh, maybe affordability is very different in city limits versus in some of the exurbs, and creating a smaller area market rent to allow vouchers to be more accessible. So I think those are two things that are kind of under consideration. I think there are communities that are using those small area FMRs, but as far as I know, Raleigh is not among them.
Okay.
I see Greg Warren here. Greg, is there anything additional you could add to that?
I would ask Liz Edgerton, who's our interim CEO at Raleigh Housing Authority, to see if we want to add it. I'm a Housing Authority Commissioner.
Where is she?
Liz, stand up.
Would you mind coming to the microphone if there's something, think from a Raleigh Housing Authority standpoint, this could be helpful information?
So I'm not the expert in that field, but from what I know, we are allowed to look at the small area rent, and I think our director does do that to see what's the better option. Unfortunately, I think those FMRs, by the time they, especially in the last few years, by the time they get updated, we've had some large rental increases, and the FMRs didn't keep up with that. But they do allow us to go with special permission at 120% above the FMRs. So our director does look at that to see if that's an option, and we did do that on different sizes of bedrooms, especially the more bedroom sizes that people were wanting, which I think was the 1, 2s, and 3 bedrooms. So we did increase those FMRs, and they recently did, HUD did put out some new numbers, so that did help that situation. But I think it's, we have to look at, there's pros and cons to going up to the 120% because as we do that, I think it can cut down on some of our funding because we're using it in that aspect. So then we might not be able to utilize 100% of our vouchers and help as many families. So we have to be mindful of that as well.
It's all a balancing act. Megan, did that answer your question?
Yeah, answered that one. Thank you. I got some others though. Also wanted to, sorry, I'm trying to find the slide. The lease to home program. I know this is through the county, but I was curious if you had any numbers on the uptake, the utilization of this program, like the effectiveness of it so far.
I don't, and I believe it literally just launched, like maybe last month.
Oh, okay.
So I'm doubtful that there are many numbers, but I can ask, I can find out.
Okay, cool. That'd be awesome. And then I am aware of from education y'all have provided, but I hope I'm going to ask so you can kind of share with the public. I know that there are components of construction that LIHTC will not cover. There's a type of construction they support, and then there are things like elevators that they don't support. Could you kind of give us a rundown of like what is sort of commonly built in a LIHTC project and not?
Sure. And I might need Larry's help here, or maybe Greg's help. But so I think what you're referring to is eligible basis in the LIHTC program. So there are certain things that certain development costs that are eligible to get a tax credit, return for that cost. And so kind of the higher your eligible basis is in a project, the more costs that fall into that category, the more tax credits you can get for that project. I know some big pieces that do not fall into basis are the land is a big one, which is why one of the city's strategies in providing gap financing is to help with the land. Not sure about a ton of others, but I think it's anything that's not depreciable, right?
Well, I think the biggest question that you might be asking is the difference between a 9% and a 4% tax credit. With the 9%, which is the most lucrative, you're basically boxed into stick-built construction with surface parking and a certain cost or limit. With the 4%, which is what we have utilized most often, most recently, those cost constraints do not apply. But again, with that traditional 9%, it's a certain construction type, and beyond that, you just forget about it.
Any additional questions? Councilor Harrison?
Yeah, just curious about maximum uptake on the LIHTC programs. So it sounds like it's kind of based on state funds that are available. Are there any opportunities that you see on the horizon to increase those increase participation among our development community?
Well, I would say that I don't know that participation is necessarily the limiting factor. So the amount of tax credits that the state can allocate is set by a formula based on population, et cetera. And then the state has its own kind of method for allocating tax credits to different parts of the state. So metro counties, east, west, and that sort of thing. And within that, there are some limits on which counties in those areas can receive tax credits. The competition is pretty fierce on the 9%, as you've alluded to. And 4%, we are actually seeing quite a bit of interest from out-of-town developers. We've had strong local players that have always been doing both 9 and 4% projects in our market, but we've recently partnered with or seen interest from out-of-state developers who want to kind of come into the Raleigh market and build 4% projects. So I do think that there is a lot of interest in doing LIHTC projects here, both locally and from folks.
So is the main constraint on increasing them, it's that subsidy that's required still? Like there's still some amount that we've...
So on the 9% side, the main constraint is the number of, it's a more competitive process. So only so many projects can be awarded. And what we've seen lately is that the city's really only getting one project per year, maybe two. On the 4% side, that is not really a factor, and in that case, the constraint is definitely more, gap financing to make those projects feasible. They could, projects based on the eligible basis are only eligible for so much tax credit equity, and then the remainder has to be made up with either bank debt or gap financing.
Thanks.
Councilmember Patton?
Sorry, one more. Can you talk to us a little bit about redevelopment when these affordable areas come up on the 30-year affordability marker? Like, kind of what's the profile of what happens then?
Yeah, I'm not a huge expert there, but I would say that largely those projects do tend to stay affordable. They'll be resyndicated for more tax credits and rehabilitated, especially if the original developer owner is, a mission-driven developer or nonprofit. That's not always the case. Sometimes they'll convert to market rate. I don't know all the kind of rules around giving tenants notice and that whole process when that 30-year mark is arriving, but that does happen in some cases. But I believe a good portion of tax credits do end up staying affordable beyond that initial 30-year period, quite often.
Councilmember Jones?
Thank you so much for the presentation. It kind of sounds doom and gloom, like, oh, we can't really do anything. So it's a little disheartening sitting on the side. And so I don't have any answers, but I do have questions about how we look at the future. If what we have in your presentation is not going to work, the things, the tools that we have now, and I'm trying to envision a new world and like, what could we build? I think about all the empty office space that we have in all across the United States. And I don't know if you can answer this. I'm just trying to throw it out there as we're having this conversation on affordable housing. How do we turn that into space that can be utilized for affordability? Is that in discussion anywhere? Is it something that's feasible? And if not, why?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer. It's not something that I think is really in discussion, at least in our department. That's probably more of a question for the development community, how to make that feasible, how to make that happen. As we kind of talked about in this presentation, the tried and true method, currently under current federal programs and laws and local programs and laws to create affordable units is really the low-income housing tax credit. And we're certainly trying to find more creative ways and add tools to the toolbox outside of that program. But it's really the flagship program that creates new units.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but as we're talking about the possibility, Chapel Hill's doing, but they're not creating this, and this is doing, but it's not.
Yeah.
If I'm not going to be able to pull any more out of what we've been doing. So as we look to create something for the future in different, what would comes up in my mind as what the city could do. I guess I'm asking what limitations in zoning or in code enforcement that would prohibit residential space in office space. Like, is there stuff that the city is saying, no, we can't do that because we won't allow that? And how can we break down those barriers so that because if we have rules, developers aren't even going to try right now. They're not even going to look at it. So I guess that's what I'm asking.
Okay, I understand your question. Yeah. I'd probably defer to if there are planners in the room.
Ken Bowers.
Sure.
If you can visualize the building right there on St. Mary Street, just north of Wade Avenue, there on the right, that is a condo from an office building conversion. So it certainly, can be done. So, and again, conceivably, an adaptive reuse under the 4% going forward could be in something that was previously used in some type of commercial space. Obviously we have lots of examples of hotels with the Sir Walter, being a prime example. It was a hotel, and then years ago it was converted to elderly housing, and then most recently we extended that life again with a new developer and a renovation. So the adaptive reuse of commercial space is something that potentially could be expanded going forward, and if it could be made to work under the 4% model, then I think probably there are people who'd want to look at that.
Right. I had a conversation with DRA, and when we were talking about this, there's the initial pushback of in office space or commercial space, the water lines are in one section, they're all built one way. And I kind of think of the SROs, like how do we rethink what this can be so that it's not all individual, apartments, but in some instances, not for families, but in some instances, how come it's not like a dorm, like, okay, we put all of the bathrooms in so that it fits with what the commercial space is currently, so those are just ideas that I'm throwing around. Cause I think I'm just going to continue to feel defeated if every time we talk about affordable housing, I'm just like, oh, everything we've thought of that's not going to work. But I feel like we're just trying to do the same thing. So I'm just trying to throw something out there.
But again, I think whether a given building is a feasible candidate for adaptive reuse would, as you indicated, would kind of be a function of how that was built and things like plumbing, obviously that factors into it. But please don't feel depressed. We're trying to tell you that historically Raleigh and the City Council has done all the right things. We are more affordable than our peer cities because we have always championed by right zoning. We have done all the right things. The way that units are created through the affordable housing is through the low-income housing tax credit program, and Raleigh was the leader, along with Charlotte, with saying, all right, let's go after the 4% because that tax credit authority is unlimited.
And
so
in
again,
no way am I trying.
Don't be defeated.
I promise you, in no way am I
critiquing
at all. It's me saying how to, even with that, even with Raleigh being great, and I'm applauding, that's fantastic. I still have people on the street. I still have people who need it. So as much as I am proud of the work that's been done, my job is to help push to the next level so that we get more people housed instead of, kind of sitting back. So not that you are, but I'm just saying I don't want to get to that point where we just aren't able to think of new things. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay.
So Ken Bowers, were you going to call Ken?
Oh, no, I was going to ask Ken if he could come up, but in the meantime, I wanted to also mention some of the trends we saw at the U.S. Conference of Mayors were really interesting. The hotel conversions were very active. Turning commercial and retrofitting them, very expensive. And what we saw was the hotel conversions with individual kitchenettes being put in each room because then they are eligible for vouchers. So I guess one of the HUD rules is you cannot use vouchers for shared housing. You have to, the units have to have their own bathrooms and kitchens. So that was a big trend that we saw and heard from a lot of communities across the country. Ken?
Yeah, so on the conversion of office buildings as it relates to the UDO, the vast majority of office buildings probably sit within an OX or CX zoning district, which does allow housing, so that's not a barrier. There is an office park district in the code, though, that does cover some office areas that does not allow housing as a primary use. And planning staff have had a discussion, is this an outdated concept, and should we retire the OP district and replace it with OX zoning? And it's one of those things where a lot of people think this is probably a good idea, but it's never risen to a major priority where staff has made a push to do it. However, if the council is interested in exploring that, that's something we could come back to you and give a report on what it would take, both in terms of amending our land use framework and the comprehensive plan, as well as amending the UDO. The building code obviously is going to have a lot to say about how office buildings, and I'm not an expert in the building code. I think that would be an appropriate thing for report back. But the depth of office floor plates compared to residential, the buildings are just different shapes. Residential building is kind of like a snake with a corridor and apartments off of either side of it with a certain limitation on how deep they can be because light has to come into it. And office buildings, which had a lot of artificial light and deep floor plates, you got to make changes to sometimes the rules in order to make those viable for housing. The code living text change, everything DCM Hayward said was correct about that. It's still in the drafting phase. It was initiated through a petition, and we expect it to be in front of you sometime this year.
Thank you, Ken. Councilmember Melton?
Yeah, first, I just want to throw my support behind looking at retiring the office park or OP district. One, for affordability reasons, and two, it just screams to me like an auto-dependency separation of uses that we thought was a good idea decades ago, and now we know that complete communities is the better way to go for multitude of reasons. And then the other thing I just wanted to say, hearing some of Councilmember Jones's comments, I think my big takeaway from this is I would love if your office felt empowered to bring to us new ideas, things we could be thinking about doing. I know that you said that Raleigh has traditionally done a lot. We've been a leader in a lot of areas. That's good. And that perhaps we've remained relatively affordable because we continue to allow things to happen with less of, I guess, a burden on the process. But if there are things that we haven't thought about or things that you think we could be doing to help increase affordability and affordable housing, I think we would all be very receptive to that. And so if you can bring us stuff periodically or all at once, I would be very excited about it. And maybe we can start with removing OP, Office Park.
Okay, any other questions?
I was just going to say I agree in getting rid of OP, but also, y'all, let's just keep in mind, we just added storage units to OP. So we're gonna probably either make that change and take that back out as well. So, because we don't want anyone in a storage unit for housing. So.
Okay, any other questions? All right, I just want to thank y'all for putting together this information. Did you have your hand raised, Mary?
I raised it, but you didn't see it. It's okay. Hi, Erica. You're a really great orator. I just want to start there. So I didn't really have any questions. I think this was a really great presentation. I didn't really mirror what Councilor Jones felt because I feel like this was more of a narrative around where we've been going in the history of what has happened. But I didn't say anything because all I had was like holes for like questions and holes, like why does an inclusionary and voluntary, what's the barriers to that, like how much did Chapel Hill, like how big is Chapel Hill compared to Raleigh, how many people are moving there, what has been like the average income of the people who have lived there compared to Raleigh. It's like those aren't helpful in the conversation of affordable housing. So I did mirror a lot of what was said, and I just wanted to like state that I feel like this was a really great presentation, that I think a lot of us have kind of gotten to the nitty gritty of some of this work prior to this work session, because it seems to come up a little bit later in April, and I think we had a lot of these questions back during our work retreat, and it's just kind of the timing of things. And it's like, so I understand that, you know, you have to include certain things around like voluntary inclusionary zoning, even though it's not allowed. One of the things I wrote down was that I do think rent control would be an interesting thing. As one of the only renters here, I live in a 2-bedroom, and I know I pay way more than $1,200 for it. It's just interesting, some of the factoids that came out of this presentation, and I just really enjoyed your oration of it all. That was really my comment. But just wanted to also say that I mirrored kind of Councilor Jones's like sentiment around what can we be doing more of, as well as like something that Councilor Melton said too, just like bringing those ideas to us to have deeper conversations. But thank you so much.
One of the things I would like to say, Larry, since you came on board, we have done things differently, and using the land that we own from a city standpoint, Idlewild is a great example. Having the RFP process, but then we sell the land for $1. So that all of a sudden makes it more affordable to build there. You've done that in many instances, just coming up with creative solutions for the ways that we can use the property that we own and that we hope have control over. So I want to see that continue because that really does make a statement. And I will tell you, a lot of people in the development community, especially on nonprofit developers, that's what gives them the ability to continue to move forward. And I think these 2 new properties that we're putting up for RFP on Summit and then off Rock Quarry, that's going to be really interesting too. So I can't wait to see what kind of creative ideas come back. I hope people really look at missing middle housing as a new opportunity and not just apartment rentals. So, I mean, I think the sky's the limit on what we can do is just keep being creative and using our assets to the best possible way. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you so much. And everybody have a good evening and go Canes. We need a win.